So, was that manual music or automated music?
Well, I was using my hands, both of them.
So manual.
So I guess that would be manual, yeah.
Yes. Do you play electronic keyboards?
I do. Yeah, I have a collection at home.
Sequencers?
Yeah, and I can use some programs on my computer for sequencing as well.
But do you think of that as automated music at all?
I'm not sure what that would mean exactly.
See, this is kind of my point.
Unless I wake up in the morning and my synthesizers have composed a song for me, unbeknownst to me.
Until that day happens.
Yeah, that would be quite remarkable. I would be delighted
Astonishing.
and perhaps a bit scared if that happened. But.
Yeah. So here we go. This is an opportunity to do a different kind of keynote. Instead of me standing in front of a lectern or a podium someplace, I'm going to be all over the place. I'll be talking to different people and putting different stuff up on the screens. A different experience. I'll be in different lighting conditions, and there'll be strange things like jump cuts. And maybe some weird voiceovers too. But I hope it's going to be fun. We'll see how it goes. Here we go. So, here I am back in my office. My name is Michael Bolton. No, not that one. I've been around software development and testing for over 30 years now, which is weird because I still feel like I'm around 30 years old. I'm not, I'm older. Anyway, for ages, the notion of manual testing and automated testing have bugged me. I believe that thinking of testing as something that you do either with your hands or with machinery misrepresents testing and harms the craft. So for this presentation, I wanted to explore that idea and talk about why it bugs me so much. This blog post isn't terribly new or even terribly good, but it happens to be a representative of stuff that was around a generation ago and that's still around today. What is the author saying? We all know that automation is more reliable and reduces testing time. Manual testing, whatever that means, is being represented as something less reliable and less prestigious than automated testing. To err is human, and it is quite obvious that manual testing is error-prone, time-consuming, and monotonous for every tester. This sort of thing is pretty frustrating. Manual testing is simple and straightforward. Well, sure, as long as you don't think about it too much. However, as technologies have progressed and applications become more complex, the process of manual testing has stayed mostly unchanged. But what is that process? I reckoned I didn't understand what people meant by manual testing and automated testing, so I decided to do some social science research. I did a survey on LinkedIn. I'm doing a talk soon. Part of that talk will involve describing manual testing. I would like to survey how people, testers and non-testers alike, think and talk about the subject. So, what is manual testing? What is automated testing? How do you distinguish between the two? And then I said, please feel free to reply on this thread or via direct message. There's now upwards of 200 replies on this thread, which is kind of interesting and kind of gratifying. A lot of those were replies to clarifying questions that I asked through the course of the conversation. From the outset, I didn't know what kind of answers I was going to get, and so I didn't know exactly what I was going to find. As soon as I started seeing the data, I realized that I didn't know how I was going to make sense of it, because I didn't know how to organize it. And I didn't know how to organize it because I didn't know how to make sense of it. This is just like testing. When you're analyzing data, you go through a process of learning. Learning how to analyze data emerges from you trying to analyze the data. learning how to test a product emerges from trying to test the product. This whole business of bootstrapping and needing time to learn the product as we encounter it is a kind of bitter pill to swallow for the people we work for and work with. And so one of the things I wanted to do when I started with this talk was to find out how people in other professions manage this kind of task, where they have to make sense of things really quickly, where they have to learn very rapidly about stuff. And so I went out and I talked to a journalist.
My name's Doug Saunders. I am the international affairs columnist for the Globe and Mail.
All right, I'm just kidding. I didn't go out. He didn't go out either. Nobody's going out. It's the COVIDs. Doug is a terrific writer. He writes a weekly column for the Globe and Mail newspaper here in Toronto. He wrote a book called Arrival City, which is about the last great migration of people from the country into the cities. He wrote a book called The Myth of the Muslim Tide, which relies quite a bit on data journalism. And he also wrote a book called Maximum Canada, which is about what we have to do in our country, he believes, in order to move into the next 100 years. Part of our job as testers is to get the story about the product as quickly as possible. It's kind of like interviewing the product, I suppose. How do you make an interview efficient?
You don't want to do it efficiently. The best interviews are very inefficient. One thing that's, I think, true of both of products and people is that they don't give up their flaws on the first question. And in fact, they usually don't give up their flaws on a question, because the standard question and answer process is designed to produce a response that's kind of programmed into the person or thing. The people who teach how to do interviews, the first thing they will say is that if it's any kind of question that contains a potential answer, especially if that answer is yes or no, it's a bad question. The questions that are any good are completely open-ended questions. Journalists tend to overuse "how do you feel about?" But a good question is, how could you characterize how your morning went on blah, blah, blah day, which might be the day that you think they murdered someone or something like that. It's usually something less exciting. And then you follow up on it. And my colleague Jan Wong always said this, that ask stupid questions. The questions that elicit the best answer are the stupidest questions. Because if you try to ask a smart question, you're trying to put your ego into it, reducing things to an almost childlike simplicity, or asking the fundamental questions that as a sophisticated person, you'd like to think you already know, often elicits the most interesting stuff. But the second thing that works in every interview is go silent. And some interviewers will say, go silent and count to 60 very slowly after the person has finished before you ask any question. No, I mean, after you've asked a bunch of questions, find a point in the interview where suddenly you just count to 60 and say nothing, because that will often cause the person to say the thing they really want to say. The number of journalists who've had interviews that have revealed really seismic stuff, where the juicy stuff in the interview has occurred when you finish the actual formal interview, and the person is putting on their coat and walking to the door, and you're having small talk, and at that period they suddenly say the explosive thing that makes the interview. That is extremely common. This is why you never say the interview is over. And you keep your notebook open or your tape rolling until the person is out the door and in their car. Because the point when it feels to both of you like the capital I interview is over is the point when the actual stuff comes out.
That sounds a lot like testing to me, because there have been lots of times when I've noticed something happening after I thought the test was finished. Also, I don't know from the get-go which way the testing is going to go. Is journalism like that?
Investigative journalism is a funny thing, because it's rarely a case where you know what the thing is right at the outset. Occasionally it is, where somebody you know who works somewhere leaks you something, and that the leaking of that thing is 100% of your story. More often, you have a suspicion that there might be something, and you either try to get someone to leak you something, or you file an access to information request, or you use some other techniques. There's an awful lot of stuff that's just there, and nobody's bothered to look at it. But often the compiling of multiple little pieces of data or observation that by themselves aren't very exciting into a congruent whole, a wider whole, and the patterns that emerge between those things tell you more than that.
So would you say that journalism is an exploratory process?
It should be. There are a lot of things that fall under the rubric of journalism. It's not a profession. It's not even a skilled trade. It's a practice. I call it a reflex of democracy. Anybody can do it. Something upstairs of 95% of the population of a country like Canada possesses the requisite skills to do it, not necessarily to do it well.
Yeah, testing's like that too.
And there are forms of journalism in print which simply consist in ripping something off the fax machine or nowadays the inbox from a publicist from somewhere and reproducing it in slightly different language. But I would argue that to be done well and to be worthwhile and interesting, yes, journalism does require some initiative, some curiosity, and some intent to go beyond what is simply presented to you by the people who present things.
Does anybody in your trade talk about automated journalism?
I'm not sure I've ever seen automated journalism, with the exception of what we used to call the agate, which was the many pages of the newspaper that were devoted to the stocks and bonds listings and so on, which was semi-automated in its time and was a big expense. I'm aware of the existence of something called automated journalism, and I don't really know. I don't know if it would pass the Turing test.
All right, back to the LinkedIn data. I tidied up the raw text that I had got from the LinkedIn replies, and most of them were thoughtful. There were a few flippant ones. There seemed to be a lot of inconsistency, though, in terms of what people thought of and what they meant by automated and manual testing. And it was really interesting to me the degree to which people seemed to dodge the question. That is, very few people tried to identify exactly what one was and what the other was. So I decided to look at things a little bit more carefully, and to do that, I took my raw text and I put it into an Excel spreadsheet. And I started to do some classification and summarizing. I did some rough categorization of the data. I identified what people's names were. That's in a hidden column. Their own description of themselves from their LinkedIn profile. I included their summary of manual testing, their summary of automated testing. I tried to track whether it was a serious answer and a good answer, and those are arbitrary categories, but I wanted to just get a sense of that. I tagged whether they answered the original question in terms of the division between manual and automated testing. I tracked whether I asked a follow-up and whether they answered the follow-up. I thought initially that I would get more replies that manual testing was like an end user, so I created a category for that. And then I collected some notes when I thought they said something particularly interesting or insightful. Here's some examples of what the replies were. As a manual tester, I like to understand who the end user of the system application will be, then write and execute tests on that basis. So there we have the sense of testing like an end user. Automation testing is great for bulk repetitive testing, but doesn't allow for human interaction. Okay, but it doesn't seem to describe what automation testing is. Personal coach provided no answer to what Manual testing is, simply said, that real testing cannot be automated. Once automated, it's simply just checking. A business analyst says, for me, manual testing is a test case that is not handled 100% by code. A manual test case may require the use of code or script, though. Automated tests are coded scripts. So that seems like an actual answer to the question, what is automated testing? Coded scripts that complete an entire test case without intervention from a human. Here's an answer that I classified as not particularly serious. Manual testing is a workaround for automated testing. Another non-serious answer is this one. Manual testing is that thing you do to waste time before automation. Here's some introspection on what part of automated testing actually involves testing. Building a framework? No. Writing test cases? No, as they do nothing until executed. So how about running automation? Not really, as the IDE only follows instructions without evaluation. And that seems to me to be really key. The idea of preparation and intention and evaluation. Are those things not part of a test? They must be part of a test. So I like this reply. He suggests that all testing, yes, all testing is manual as it requires human thinking and constant evaluation. Also, testing includes learning and experience, which automation has not quite achieved yet. A little farther down here, we have someone who says, I would say manual testing is when you're actively gathering information and learning about the thing under test. This can even include writing code. Perhaps one would want to manipulate some JavaScript on the page to learn how the page behaves. And the summary of automated testing is any check that is run automatically, completing some scenarios which have been written based on what we've learned about the application under test. There's a lot of stuff to process here. So I decided to talk to a couple of experienced test managers to see what they said.
I am Mary Ann Sweat. I am a senior test engineering manager at LendingTree in Charlotte, North Carolina.
So how do you think about manual testing and automated testing?
You can't just have this mindless automaton just writing code. And so I've never agreed with the idea of the separation of duties. Testing is testing. Either you're using the application as an end user would, or you're writing code to simulate what the end user was doing. And I don't think it's a good idea to separate those. And organizationally, we don't where I work. And so the expectation is that every test engineer can both manually and as an end user exercise the application, using a variety of black box testing techniques, but then also be able to open up our Java solution and write Selenium code and get in there and do everything that needs to be done for that as well. If you're dealing with an application that's going to be given to a consumer or a business partner, if it's a B2B situation, you want to exercise the application as they would. Use the keyboard, type in the information that they're looking for, mouse, that kind of thing. But if you're responsible for testing web services, then you might be simulating somebody calling the application using a harness like Postman or Fiddler or that kind of thing. So it's not really like an end user per se, because there isn't a human user. There's a system that's going to be integrating, but it's still sort of using it in the expected sphere of how that system is going to be implemented, either as a person navigating a website, or a client server application, or as a service communicating to itself, or to its calling applications along the way. If you're talking about the world of web services where everything's tiny and microservice infrastructure and all that other stuff.
Isn't there always a human in the loop, though? When a programmer is using an interface, isn't the programmer the user?
Yeah. So everything, if you build anything, be it a web service, a microservice, an application, a web page, there has to be a user of some sort. Either it's a person or it's a system talking to two systems, right? So if you think about in the financial services industry, if you are executing a stock trade, for example, well, there's a human that's executing that stock trade, either calling their broker and they're entering into a system, or using an application like E-Trade. But then E-Trade has a whole bunch of systems it's communicating with to settle the trade and that kind of thing. And so those systems are using each other to sort of act on the desire of the person that initiated the transaction. But at the end of the day, the user says, okay, I'm going to sell 50 shares of Amazon. And then the system goes, okay, I need to talk to the settlement services. I need to make sure that the wire transfer for the money gets sent over. And then ultimately the result is I have 50 shares of Amazon that sold, and here's my money.
After I talked to Marianne, I talked to my friend Juka.
I'm Juka Selendik. I live in Milwaukee, and I'm a test manager at Northwestern Mutual. And also, of course, a tester.
You're a test manager, Juka. What's the difference between manual and automated testing to you?
Well, I prefer not to talk about my craft that way, because I don't believe that testing is a manual type job. I think testing takes a lot of critical thought, a lot of sense making. It takes a lot of just cognitive ability. And it is not something that is just a job that you kind of fall asleep at. You know, you have to think to actually be able to produce a good service to our clients. So I don't like to put the craft into such silly dichotomies. Really, that's what they are. And every time I hear people say I'm a manual tester, you know, my heart just breaks a little bit because I just feel it's such a tragic way to describe our profession. There's no like thought that testing could be something else. It's just like we do these tests manually, we write these tests, whatever they are. They never say what tests or how. It's we're just going to manually test this. And then we're going to turn those manual tests into automation tests and call that testing. Testing isn't manual. Testing cannot be automated because it is a human process. It is a human activity that a human does. So I guess I don't really know all the time what people mean by manual and automated testing.
After all this thinking and talking, it was time for a break to clear my head. Machinery never does that. It's all too easy for me to get over-focused and stuck in a rut. Every now and again I need to get out of the office or the lab and remind myself of the world around me. And climbing onto my bike is one of my favorite ways to do that. A bicycle's an amazing thing. For me, it's just like my favorite test tools. It's simple and it's powerful. It's inexpensive. It's easy to maintain. But don't get me wrong, I use cars and trains and airplanes like everybody else when I want to go long distances in a hurry. But there's a trade-off with those things. There are lots of places where they can't go. And as far as they might get me, I miss a lot of the details along the way. On my bike, I can choose to slow down and look at interesting things. And if I want to, it's easy for me to stop and explore places where wheels and machinery can't take me. When I'm on my bike, I'm not just moving from place to place. I'm experiencing the world. I'm seeing the things around me. I'm interacting with other people. Hi, how's it going? Hi. New code, old code. Lots of bugs in it. Guess that's why they took it down. Sometimes it's a really good idea to go slowly and reflectively and take in what's around you. On the other hand, you can make a lot of progress quickly with people-powered approaches when the supposedly faster automated stuff runs into obstacles of one kind or another. On my way home, I dropped in on my friend Paul Dutton.
My name is Paul Dutton. What I've done in my work that you're most interested in is copy editing. I've made my living for most of my adult life as a writer of one sort or another. I've been a copywriter, a creative writer, an essay writer. By that I mean belles lettres. And I'm also a reader, which I think is pretty important to what you're interested in. I'm both a reader and a copy editor. The client can be a publisher, an editor, a writer. I consider myself to be the liaison between the the text, even. Not even the author, but the text and the reader. So if this text has if a sentence has confusing syntax, then I sort it out. I'm there to see that the reader doesn't have to make those leaps, so that it reads smoothly and unambiguously. A copy editor makes sense out of sentences that don't make sense. A copy editor adjusts syntax, corrects syntax. The client has the last word. The client is the one who accepts or rejects. So the copy editor's changes or corrections.
Is copy editing a manual process or an automated process?
Those aren't the terms that I would use. It's an intellectual process. There are automated aspects of it. Spell check, it's sometimes helpful because you might have missed a spelling here or there.
So James, what do you think about all this? I have been asking people about manual and automated testing. What do you think about those terms?
I don't think there's any such thing as automated testing. I used the phrase automated testing for many years, but now, like a smoker, I have quit because I realized that it's toxic, that it harms the craft of testing to speak of it as if it can be automated. As soon as you speak of automated testing, you locate testing out of the person and out of the person's mind, which turns it into a commodity activity, which turns it into a task, which legitimizes thinking about testing as an inhuman mechanical task. But good testing is not an inhuman mechanical task.
What kind of task is it?
It's a social task. It's a social act to test software, because every moment of testing is an exploration, not just of the product, but of what significance the product has to a human social system. We only test because the behavior of this product has some meaning and some significance to other people. So we are making constant social judgments about what kinds of things are worth doing and what are the implications of what we see. And based on those judgments, which only a human can make, then we take different actions.
All right then, if testing is a social process, who are you going to call? How about a sociologist?
So I'm Harry Collins. I'm a professor here at Cardiff University. And I've been writing for a long time about the nature of knowledge. I'm a sociologist. I suppose I'm a sociologist of knowledge.
Harry has never written a book on software testing as such, but he's written a ton of books. And a bunch of them have great relevance for testers. Too many to list here. Let's settle for The Shape of Actions, Tacit and Explicit Knowledge, and Artificial Intelligence.
Pleased to see that you guys quite like what my work, because it fits with the sorts of things that you're trying to say as well.
Harry has been studying the nature of knowledge, science and scientists, artificial intelligence, all those things and how they relate to each other for a long time. And as a sociologist, he understands really well what testers need to do, and he puts it beautifully.
Well, the first bit's easy anyway. The fact is that computers are mechanical objects. They're like cars or sets of cogs or something like that. In fact, the first one was literally a set of cogs, wasn't it? The Babbage machine was all brass wheels and cogs and so on and so forth. It's probably quite useful to continue to think of computers these days as essentially Babbage machines. They're just instantiated in silicon chips and that sort of stuff. But that's one of the things they are. They're those things that where all the cogs have to work together. And if you start missing teeth from the cogs or something like that, they'll go wrong. So one way of thinking about testing computers is to find out whether all the teeth are there and whether the cogs are whirring right and so on and so forth. But that's the easy bit.
This fits perfectly with the distinction that we make in rapid software testing between testing and checking. Let's call this checking, not testing. It's part of testing, but it's the easy bit. When we check a product, we operate it mechanistically to check specific facts about it. We operate it and observe it. We interact with it in specific algorithmic ways to collect specific observations. We apply algorithmic decision rules to those observations, and then we report the outputs of the evaluations algorithmically, just like the spelling checkers that editors use, or the checkers in IDEs and compilers that programmers rely on.
The second job of computer testers is to decide whether a machine is close enough in what it's doing to allow the humans who are using it to make up for its mistakes and errors that they see going on. And that's the second part of testing. It's not just seeing whether there are teeth missing from the cogs, but whether the machine is actually doing something near enough to what we want, whether the machine is a sufficiently close social prosthesis for us to be able to use it.
Hang on, what do you mean by prosthesis?
Well, a prosthesis is something, I lose my leg, I replace it with an artificial leg. That artificial leg does not do exactly the same as the original leg does. But if it's close enough, I'll still be able to make up its deficiencies to walk on it. Same goes for an artificial heart. It doesn't act exactly as a normal heart. It does things a bit different, but my body can make up for the differences. And so the second part of testing is to decide, is this thing near enough for the humans to make up for the deficiencies of the prosthesis, the differences in the way the prosthesis acts to the way a human would act in those circumstances.
That's what testing is all about. It's not just about checking the output to see if some calculation went correctly. Testing is evaluating a product by learning about it through experiencing and exploring and experimenting, which includes, to some degree, questioning the product, studying it, modeling it, observing it, manipulating it, making inferences about it, making conjectures about risk, and how the value of the product might be threatened to people who matter. That's not a process that can be automated, but it's equally crazy to think about it as a manual process. It's a cognitive process, and it's a social process. I was wondering how we got here. And then this idea occurred to me, inspired by Harry Collins's book, Tacit and Explicit Knowledge, when he talks about explicit knowledge, knowledge that has been told, versus tacit knowledge, knowledge that is for some reason not told. And as he describes it, he points out that explicit knowledge is parasitic on tacit knowledge. You can't have explicit knowledge, you can't have something is told until you know it. So the explicit knowledge is parasitic on tacit knowledge. But then he makes a really interesting move. He points out that the idea of tacit knowledge is parasitic on explicit knowledge. That is to say, before there was such a thing recognized as explicit knowledge, there was no real need to talk about tacit knowledge. It was just knowledge. And it occurred to me that as soon as people started talking about automated testing, they needed a contrast to talk about all the stuff that wasn't automated testing. And they thought, okay, well, what do we got? We've got automated. What's the opposite of automated? Manual. And so they landed on that as the means of describing all the stuff about testing that was not the bits that you can automate.
Yes, I think we can diagram it actually, and it might make it clearer. If you look at my screen here, I'm gonna draw a circle, and this circle I want to call testing.
All right.
And this represents everything that a tester thinks, everything that a tester does, everything that is in the process of software testing. Now, some of that is easy to see, some of that is hard to see. Some of that is highly legible to outsiders or people sitting next to you, and other stuff is not so highly legible.
So you mean, for example, the visible behaviors, the pressing of buttons, the looking up of results.
Exactly. Now, the thing is that automation, then some of this can be automated, and automation takes some of what's in testing and has a computer do it. No problem. We'll call that automation. Now, you would think that the contrast then becomes between testing as a whole and the specific stuff that automation does. But that's not what happens for the most part. It turns out that what happens is that when people say, what's the opposite of automation? They tend to look at automation and say, what would happen to automation, this stuff in the middle here, if we took out the computer and all the things the computer is doing? And that leads to another small circle with a little sad human in it, trying to do all the things that the computer was doing. So then they say, all right, well, this is automated and this is manual.
But then there's
as if the distinction is between a computer doing millions of operations per second and a human doing those exact same operations, but much slower and much more error prone. And in that sense, the concept of manual testing, as it is generally used when people say it, is a mistake. It's a false distinction. That the proper comparison is between what you can automate, which we call checking, and the full egg of testing, which we call testing.
Well, here's another thing that bothers me about it, and that is that at the same time as we're over-focused on automated checking, we're kind of ignoring more powerful ways to use tools, and in fact, more powerful ways to use maybe simpler tools that can get a lot of really important work done in terms of preparation, in terms of organization, wrangling data, creating data, visualizing data.
Right, so there's two problems. One problem is that when we speak of manual testing, the testing community, we too often are falsely contrasting the oversimplified automation process with that same process, but without the computers. And we're calling that manual testing. But that's already a grossly oversimplified version of what the humans were doing. It's as if the automators were saying, first, I am going to ignore everything that I can't do better than the humans. First, I'll ignore it. Then I'll pretend it never existed. First, I ignore it and I create my automation. Then I pretend it never existed. And when I talk about manual testing and say, oh, those manual testers can't do what my tools can do. So that's one problem. But the second problem is that oversimplification in the first place has ignored lots of ways that automation can actually help us as humans to test better. So what if we have a different idea about automation, which says, here's a human. The human cannot be automated. The human is not reduced or represented by the automation in any way. What we say instead is that the human and the machine have a partnership within a test process. Then what you have is you no longer have automated testing and manual testing anymore. Now you just have testing, which is assisted by machines in different interesting ways. And when you want to talk about stuff that only the machine is doing, our recommendation is just be specific about what you mean. Do you mean automated output checking? Okay, then say that. Do you mean automated data generation? Well, say that. Do you mean automated log file analysis? That's fine. Say log file analysis. There's lots of different ways that we can solve this problem by always seeing the human and the computer as being partners within the testing process.
Although I want to say that the tooling is a minority partner, that the important parts of testing don't happen on the machinery. When I was on my bike ride, a lot of things reoccurred to me in terms of some of the stuff that we've been talking about to try to give people sharper, more precise terms to describe what they're doing when they're doing so-called manual testing. And one of them was experiential. I should probably pause for a second and differentiate between experiential and exploratory testing, because to a lot of people it's going to sound like the same thing. Exploratory testing is about agency. It's about the degree to which the tester is in control of his or her decisions and choices in the moment. All testing performed by a human is exploratory to some degree. Testing is scripted to the degree that something or someone else controls or constrains a tester. So all testing is scripted to some degree. To differentiate between that and experiential testing, we need a couple extra words. We need to think about an encounter with the product. That is to say, a situation in which someone perceives the product. We need to think about the contemplated user. That is somebody that the tester has in mind as a user of the product in some sense as the tester is designing and performing tests. We also need to think about a medium. A medium is something that intervenes, something that gets in between someone or something and someone or something else as the tester is performing a test. So experiential testing is about the tester's encounter with the product, the degree to which it is naturalistic, the degree to which it represents or reproduces the experience of a user that the tester is contemplating. Instrumented testing is testing wherein some medium, that is something between the tester and the product, affects or influences or filters or changes the tester's encounter with the product compared to that of the contemplated user. Experiential testing is about how we interact with the product. It is not necessarily exploratory, although it might be, and it probably should be. Experiential testing is about how we engage with the product as users, but that doesn't just mean human users. It doesn't just mean encountering the product with our eyes and our fingertips and our minds. It means encountering the product like users. It's not just that the users are people, even though that's important. The important thing about many users is that they're social agents who have expertise in specific forms of life, specific expertise. And those forms of life are not like our own.
If you really want to do the job properly, you've got to get sufficiently immersed in the user's form of life to understand what they want. But that doesn't mean to say you've actually got to become a user. It means you've got to spend a lot of time talking and immersed in the discourse of the users. And I don't think people take that seriously enough.
That form of life could include, for example, a developer who is encountering the product through its API, but also through the API's documentation and through the API's quirks and through the API's error messages. In order to understand that stuff, we have to immerse ourselves in the worlds of the user. Now, it's not the case necessarily that businesses make it easy for us to do that, but maybe it would be a good idea for us to figure out how to get that done if we want to find bugs that matter for people. But then this diagram that you've just drawn suggests attended versus unattended.
That's right. When we move right on that diagram, when we go from automation, which is already a simplified, filtered aspect of testing, and then we say, now what if we took all of the machinery out of that and just had a human do it? Wouldn't that be very inefficient? People are talking about attended testing, you could say, human attended testing. And if you ignore all of the other aspects of what rich, wonderful things that the word manual could mean, it explains why people don't respect manual testing. They're only talking about one of the many aspects of what we call testing. You want to run through those aspects that we came up with?
Experiential is one of them. That was the one that really excited me when I was talking to a tester about a year and a half ago, when she was really worried about people replacing all the manual testers on the team. So I said to her, you're not a manual tester. I struggled with it because I wanted to offer her something more. I said, you get experience of the product. You treat the product as though you were some user that you could imagine, some human user was using it. And then all the way along, we've had exploratory. And then I think you came up with another one that I named, but it was your description of it. And that was speculative.
Yes, speculative is the aspect of the testing process that only a human can do, where you are asking a question. You're wondering if something is possible, and then you pursue that line of inquiry. Speculative is as opposed to demonstrative. Demonstrative being when you have a specific thing that you are trying to show, and you show that one thing, and you see exactly what you expect.
Then there was responsible, which was another thing that you contributed to this list.
Right, responsible versus supportive. Responsible means that a human is accountable, so taking responsibility for the quality of the work. Machines can't do that. No machine takes responsibility for the work. If your machine fails you, you don't sue it in a court of law for breach of contract. You sue the person who sold it to you, or you blame yourself. But a machine cannot take responsibility in the same way that a human can.
And I think if we have a list of things, growing was another one, where the activity of testing changes you in some sense. You learn something, or you come up with another idea for a test, or you see a new risk, things like that.
Yes, just the act of being a human involved in a process changes you. You can't help but being changed. And if you are changed, you may be changed for the better, you may be changed for the worse. But part of the art of software testing is to arrange to be changed for the better by the experiences that we have.
I think we're onto something important here, because a lot of testers, when they say I'm a manual tester, I think what they mean is I'm not a coder. I don't write code, but I'm having a hard time explaining what that means. And I think this list of things that they could think about and talk about would give them some vocabulary. We can get rid of the manual part and talk about these specific things much more clearly.
Yeah, I think it's a lot like I recently read about jaywalking laws, and that jaywalking laws were laws that were created to protect car drivers, people driving automobiles, and to blame pedestrians for being hit by cars instead of blaming people driving cars for hitting pedestrians. And similarly, the world of the people who like automation, they've tried to redefine testing in a way that makes automation seem like the only thing worth doing, and anything else worth doing is not important. Anything else worth doing is not worth doing by definition because it's not automation.
Which, once again, is not to say that tools are bad. We like tools. We use tools. We need tools.
Yes, we believe that automation is built, if it's going to be useful, is built upon an edifice of human responsibility, of humans taking responsibility for testing, and then the humans deploy the tools, and the humans control the tools. And as soon as you say that the only thing that matters is what the tool is doing, then humans always seem like a useless, fallible creatures that they're squishy and unimportant. But that depends on a first move, a move of defining testing only as what a tool can do. And then humans look really bad in comparison to that. So what we want to do is unmake that move so that when people say, if they're going to say manual testing, they can stand up for a very rich idea of manual testing. But our suggestion is to stop saying manual, because that word has been poisoned, and instead maybe be more specific about the kind of testing that you're talking about.
Something is going to be delivered in the air until sound waves vibrate in the air, no music happens.
Yes, that's right. And the sound has to come from some human will making it happen, whether I press a key on the accordion or whether I press a key on a synthesizer, and a whole bunch of other complicated things happen due to some LFOs and whatever.
LFO?
Low frequency oscillator.
Ah, so there's jargon in music as well.
yes, musicians have jargon too.
All right. Well, I mean, that's I think the most important thing about it seems to me, is that it's a human pursuit, even though it might be enabled by some really sophisticated gear. But you and I don't talk about this like as manual music.
I think this would be the first time that's really come up for me, actually.
All right. Well, jigs then?
Yeah, okay.
All right. Let's see.